You've probably heard of the app Tinder, but what about Cinder? The Vatican unveiling the Catholic app dubbed Cinder by Italian media. It helps users find the nearest confessional or mass. Cinder is expected to go live early next year. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, everyone. I'm Heather Nauer. John Scott is in for Shepard Smith. Have a great day.
From embarrassment to ambassador. President-elect Donald Trump adding 2 former opponents to his cabinet, and he says he's considering a couple more. But some top Trump supporters are raising concerns about one contender. Also, your 401k on a winning streak since the election. The Dow could hit a 3rd straight lifetime high today. We'll look at what's behind the rally and the downside to sky-high stocks. Plus, AAA is predicting the busiest Thanksgiving travel weekend in a decade. We'll see how the getaway is going at some of the busiest spots across the country. That's all ahead this hour. Trump has said he's strongly considering Ben Carson for the role. Dr. Carson told our Neil Cavuto yesterday that Trump had, in fact, offered him the gig, but he also said he had multiple offers in the president-elect's cabinet. Dr. Carson does not have a background in housing, but he says he's qualified because of his childhood in Detroit and his experience treating inner-city patients. Donald Trump did nominate South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley to be his ambassador to the United Nations. As a governor, she doesn't have much foreign policy experience, but Trump today called Nikki Haley a great leader. Now, this is a big turnaround from the campaign season when the two of them repeatedly clashed over remarks that they made. Haley had embarrassed South Carolina after she criticized him for not releasing his tax returns. During the primaries, Governor Haley supported Trump's rivals, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. She said she did rather end up voting for Trump in the general election. But at the time, she also said she was, quote, not a fan. Well, today, Governor Haley said she's accepting the position out of a sense of duty. Donald Trump also announced today he is nominating Betsy DeVos to be his education secretary. She's a supporter of charter schools and a longtime Republican donor. The Washington Post reports DeVos gave money to Carly Fiorina and Jeb Bush during the primaries. She later ended up supporting Marco Rubio. She also once told the Washington Examiner newspaper she considered Donald Trump a, quote, interloper who doesn't represent the Republican Party. Peter Ducey is live in Palm Beach, Florida, where Donald Trump is spending Thanksgiving with his family. Peter, Trump and Governor Haley seem to have buried the hatchet, huh?
It seems that way, John. We're told by members of the transition team that Mr. Trump and Governor Haley have a lot of chemistry, so it was an easy selection to nominate, an easy nomination process for the president-elect. He's also saying that he thinks that she's going to do well in this new position if she's confirmed by the Senate because she is a deal maker. Meanwhile, Governor Haley is saying that she's going to stay in the State House in Columbia until Senate confirmation wraps up. But that despite everything that happened in the past, she says this, quote, when the president believes you have a major contribution to make to the welfare of our nation and to our nation's standing in the world, that is a calling that is important to heed. As for Dr. Ben Carson, we did get word late last night that he was planning to take advantage of downtime over Thanksgiving to decide about the new job, but now he's dropping hints that sound like he's made up his mind, writing on Facebook about the HUD position that, quote, after serious discussions with the Trump transition team, I feel that I can make a significant contribution, particularly to making our inner cities great for everyone. Something else notable about a Trump appointment today, that education nominee, Betsy DeVos, even Jeb Bush, the bitter rival of Donald Trump, said that he thinks it was a good pick. John.
Peter Ducey in Palm Beach. Thanks. Breaking news now and an update on the Tennessee school bus crash. Lives lost when a school bus with 37 elementary school students on board crashed in Chattanooga Monday. 3 of the children who died were in the 4th grade, 1 in 1st, another in kindergarten. Police are giving an update. Let's listen.
One priority of the Chattanooga Police Department is helping the children and the families who were impacted by this horrible crash. I'll provide you with an update on the investigation and take a few questions at the end. Currently, the Chattanooga Police Department Traffic Division has obtained warrants for all data devices contained on the bus. Our investigative team is reviewing the video from the bus. Some of the video we have shows views from the front, back, and sides. Those are currently being examined, as I said. We're also interviewing witnesses. We've not started speaking to the children involved in the crash yet, but we will in the future. That's also a very important part of our investigation. In interviewing the children, it's important that they've been impacted by traumatic incidents, that we do that in cooperation with individuals who are trained in these matters, as well as working with the parents. And we're working on coordinating those efforts. I'd like to also mention that no one was ejected from the bus during or after the crash. The media is reporting claims that the driver asked the children on the bus if they were prepared to die. I want to be very clear on this. No witness we have spoken with has that information or provided it directly to our investigators. But we have also not interviewed all witnesses yet. If anyone has firsthand information, we would request that you provide that to the Chattanooga Police Department investigators assigned to the case by simply calling the police department and speaking with one of them. As it relates to the blood draw, we received toxicology reports back today from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation that shows no trace of alcohol or drugs in the driver's system. The driver's driving history did include a minor wreck in September of this year, investigated by our agency. It's also part of the investigation. As for the patients, at this time, hospital officials tell us 6 children remain hospitalized. Out of respect and privacy for the families impacted by this tragedy, we will not be providing you with any condition updates. Again, the Chattanooga Police Department's priority is helping the families heal. Part of that healing process is reassuring them that our department and investigators are committed to a complete, thorough, and fair investigation. I'll take a couple of questions.
Did you respond to parents and victims' families who have said that they've complained about this driver before? We've seen a number of reports from different sources saying there have been complaints against this driver.
Again, we've heard those reports. That's part of the investigation currently being examined by investigators.
But there's no details related to
That's currently part of the investigation.
You say the test results show no alcohol or drugs in his system. What prompted your agency to arrest Walker Simpson after the crash?
It's part of the probable cause affidavit that's on file.
Is he still cooperating?
It's part of the investigation.
So when you say there's drugs, is that off a breathalyzer or you just toxicology with blood draws? How did you have
It's a blood draw toxicology that went to the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in Nashville.
and all of it came back negative?
All of it came back negative. Next.
Do you anticipate further charges?
Several with multiple angles. I couldn't tell you exactly how many, but we do have multiple angles.
Has the driver's story been consistent throughout your investigation with him?
It's part of the investigation. Thank
Do you
you.
anticipate further charges?
Audio of the video?
So there you have it. The investigation continues into the actions of the man who was on the right of your screen there, Jonathan Walker, the driver of that bus that crashed in Chattanooga, killing 5 students. The headline that police say they have found no evidence of alcohol or drugs in the blood samples that they have taken. However, they have not continued or completed the investigation. They are getting warrants to search the black boxes and the information they contain. School buses throughout the country contain black boxes very much like the kinds that are contained on commercial aircraft. They are data recorders that will tell investigators how fast the bus was going and some other information in the moments before it crashed. Mercedes Colwin is our Fox News legal analyst and joins us shortly. 4 of the 5 killed in that crash were girls. It is believed that the crash took place at a high rate of speed, well in excess of the posted 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. You also heard the police chief there shoot down, at least partially shoot down, one of the claims that has become public in the last 24 hours or so. Some parents said that Jonathan Walker, seen there on your screen, was asking the children on board his bus if they were prepared to die. Now, the police chief said that no one that they have spoken to yet can confirm that report. However, he also said they have not spoken to all of the witnesses that they want to speak with. So again, just a horrific scene in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The entire town very much in mourning after this bus crash that took the lives of 5 children from an elementary school there. We'll be back with more in just a moment. So the cabinet of incoming President-elect Donald Trump is taking shape. Nikki Haley to be his UN ambassador, and Betsy DeVos, a former head of the Republican Party and longtime philanthropist in Michigan, to be Education Secretary, assuming they are confirmed by the Senate. Let's talk a little bit about the Trump transition team. Joining us now, Josh Lederman, White House reporter for the Associated Press. Josh, a lot of people are surprised that people like Nikki Haley, who were vocal critics of Donald Trump during the primary campaign, are winding up with posts in his administration. What do you make of it?
That's right. One of the things that Donald Trump has not indicated is a prerequisite to being in his cabinet is having always agreed with him or having always been vocally on his side. Both Betsy DeVos and Governor Haley are people that criticized President-elect Trump pretty vigorously during the campaign and are now going to be on his team. We've seen this tendency among Trump officials to have sort of a team of rivals, have competing power centers in his administration, even people like Reince Priebus, who spent a lot of time at the RNC trying to see if someone else could be the nominee, now on board as his chief of staff. What we don't know is how that's going to play once they're in the administration. For instance, next year, if Nikki Haley is out at the UN serving as ambassador and she takes a position on something and then, we see a tweet from President Trump saying, no, that's actually not how I feel. That's not how we're going to proceed with something. What kind of a dynamic does that create, and how chaotic will that be for the future Trump administration?
Governed South Carolina, where there are a lot of international businesses that have moved in, Michelin being one of them, BMW, others like that. But she doesn't have a great deal of international diplomatic experience. Clearly, he feels that that's not something she needs. She is obviously a chief executive, and that must be what he's looking for.
Right. That type of experience going and talking with businesses about potentially investing in the state is something governors typically do, but it's not foreign policy experience. One thing that we're seeing is that the Trump cabinet is shaping up to be a cabinet of novices. You have other people that don't have a whole lot of experience. Ben Carson, who's being considered for housing and urban development, not someone who's served in government. Betsy DeVos, certainly someone who's very well known to people in education circles, but not someone who's served in a government capacity before. At the same time, Donald Trump said for months that, he had little experience in politics and he was going to be able to win anyway, and he was right about that. So whether he's able to bring in some new energy by bringing in people who haven't been in government for decades and decades could possibly be a good thing is something we're going to have to wait and see.
Is he in some ways imitating President Obama, who famously offered his Secretary of State's position to Hillary Clinton, his former rival?
Well, that's certainly a dynamic there. Hillary Clinton, of course, had a lot of foreign policy experience, having been First Lady and traveled extensively to other countries on the behalf of the U.S. And also as a long-serving senator. But certainly there's a dynamic there where he's bringing in people who were previously rivals or foes and trying to see whether their combined energy, putting everyone on the same page within the Republican Party, might be a good way to move forward, and also to have a diverse and vigorous administration that's not just comprised of people from one small sliver. That seems to be the approach that Trump is trying to take.
And what about, real quickly, the Secretary of State post? Will it be Mitt Romney?
Well, it's certainly interesting how Mitt Romney and others have been paraded before the media in Trump Tower, and this procession of candidates that have been in and out interviewing with him. It's created a lot of speculation where we're able to evaluate, as the media and the public, these candidates in real time. But we know that Mitt Romney gave a major speech during the election. The entire purpose of that speech was to say Donald Trump cannot be our president, should not be our president. It would take quite a bit of an about-face by Mitt Romney to serve as one of the highest officials in Trump's administration.
Some turn of events there in Washington. Josh Letterman, who covers the White House for the AP. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks.
Well, President-elect Trump says he might be able to keep running his businesses while also running the country. He told the New York Times, quote, "The law is totally on my side. The president can't have a conflict of interest." More on that coming up. There are a lot of questions in Washington right now. Among them, can President-elect Trump run the country while also running his worldwide business empire? He told the New York Times, quote, "The law is totally on my side. The president can't have a conflict of interest." The president-elect also says he's in the process of handing over the keys to his kingdom to his 3 older children, Donald Jr., Eric, and Ivanka. But with all 3 of them now serving on their father's White House transition team, some analysts say that's also a conflict of interest. Lawyers for the president-elect say one option they're considering is to put his business in a blind trust, meaning his children will not be allowed to talk to him about what's going on with the company. But the Wall Street Journal points out, by law, blind trusts are overseen by an independent manager, not family members, and especially not children with a very close relationship to their father. Former presidents have used this setup in the past to avoid the conflict of interest issue, but it typically only involves assets like stocks and bonds, not a business empire that requires active daily management. Sarah Westwood joins us now. She's a White House correspondent for the Washington Examiner. The president-elect says there's never been a case like this before. Is he right?
Well, he's absolutely right. There's not been a president who's had so many assets flung so far across the world. I mean, real estate holdings are difficult to offload. He can't just call up his bank and have those stocks or bonds moved overnight into treasury bills or blind trusts like former presidents have. It would involve selling off hotels and properties, and that's something that can take years. So President-elect Trump has to find a different solution that former presidents haven't used in the past, and it looks like he's leaning towards, like you mentioned, putting his children in charge of the business. That has raised red flags among government ethics watchdogs who say that isn't enough insulation between the president and the day-to-day operations of his business.
That quote in the New York Times that I mentioned a moment ago, "The law is totally on my side. The president can't have a conflict of interest." There is some support for that.
Right. It's tradition that politicians divest themselves of holdings that could pose a conflict of interest when it comes to policymaking, but it's not the law. The typical conflicts of interest laws that apply to federal employees don't extend to the president and the vice president. Now, there's a clause in the Constitution that prevents federal officials from profiting personally off foreign governments, the emoluments clause, but that's untested in the context of the presidency. So legally, Donald Trump is right that it looks like the law is on his side. But politically, it's a totally different story. It would be extremely difficult for him to continue to run the business from the White House. He would expose himself to all kinds of criticism because his business is so expansive. There are 100 different ways policies could be interpreted as benefiting his business, even if it was inadvertent.
Yeah, if he gives control of the organization to his children, at least that's what he promised to do during the campaign, is that sufficient? Is that enough of a wall between what he does as president and his business interests?
Some people who are watching this say it could be enough if he coupled it with a memorandum of understanding that he signed, promising not to discuss business operations with his children. If you remember, an MOU is exactly what Hillary Clinton signed when she became Secretary of State, and her husband and daughter continued to be involved with the Clinton Foundation. She signed an MOU saying she wouldn't discuss with them or be involved with them in the operation of the Clinton Foundation or the donor management that was required of that charity. As you well know, that MOU was not followed. Her staff consistently violated it throughout her tenure at the State Department. That came back to haunt her. It helped cost her the White House. So people are wondering if Donald Trump pursued a similar path in regards to his business while he's president, if that could open him up to the same kinds of ethical pitfalls that tripped up Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, he's got hotels all over the world, one of them in Dubai, for instance. So if the administration, if someone came to him and said, hey, we recommend a total economic blockade on the United Arab Emirates, and that's where his hotel is, you can see where the conflict might come up.
Exactly, and other politicians who are in this situation might be in a position to recuse themselves from that sort of situation, if they were in Congress, for example. But the president cannot recuse himself from any situation. And so if Donald Trump leaves in place even the perception that he could be somehow influenced by what would be best for his business, then he would leave himself open to all kinds of criticism. He would give his critics the exact fodder they want to paint him as the same kind of corrupt politician that he ran against. So he has to formalize the wall between himself and his company. He can't just assure the public that he's not going to be involved, but leave his children deeply connected both to his company and to his White House, because keep in mind they're sitting on his transition team right now. He has to make a formal show of making that firewall something that's written in stone.
We'll see what the president-elect decides. Sarah Westwood, Washington Examiner. Thanks. So President-elect Donald Trump's policy platform continues to evolve and change dramatically as he prepares to be sworn into office. His critics say it's difficult to know where he stands on many of the issues, but his transition team says Trump is just being Trump. Listen.
I think you're going to have a very unconventional presidency in Donald Trump because he's unconventional. I think many in the press, Sean, are still in campaign mode. They're scratching their heads, figuring out how to stop this guy from becoming president, or from forming a cabinet in his likeness, or from actually doing things, a flurry of activity in the first 100 days, which may in fact undo some of the legacy of their favorite president, President Obama. And they need to get over that.
Well, Donald Trump seems to be backtracking on some of his campaign promises. The president-elect told the New York Times he doesn't feel very strongly about trying to prosecute Hillary Clinton. He says it would be divisive for the country. During his campaign, Trump said he'd appoint a special prosecutor to investigate Clinton and threatened to put her in jail. But Trump told the Times he is not taking a possible investigation off the table completely. He also said he's keeping an open mind about climate change, which he used to call a hoax. In other interviews, Trump has said he might accept a fence instead of a wall in some spots along the border with Mexico, and he's said he's open to keeping parts of Obamacare instead of repealing the whole thing. So let's look at this from both sides of the aisle. Capri Cafaro is a Democratic member of the Ohio State Senate. Kristen Tate is a contributor at The Hill newspaper, also the author of the book, Government Gone Wild. Kristen, are you disappointed in what you're hearing from the president-elect?
A little bit, but not too much. Look, Trump is a deal maker, and I suspect that a lot of this toned-down rhetoric is an effort to bring his opponents into the fold. You know, Trump is not a king. He can't take a lot of actions alone. He's got to work with other people. And as a results and action-oriented guy, I think he understands that. We've also got to keep in mind that the country is very divided right now, and Trump is no longer a candidate. He's the president-elect. So a lot of what he's doing is probably an effort to unite the country and not infuriate his opponents more than they already are.
Are you surprised, Capri, at some of the positions he's taking?
You know, I'm not surprised. I mean, you know, Donald Trump, throughout the entire process of the campaign, you know, obviously said a lot of very strong things, like build the wall or lock her up. But that was very much a campaign. Donald Trump is not an ideologue. He is a pragmatist. And, you know, the fact that he is being pragmatic about the fact that, as we just said, I mean, he is president-elect of the United States. He's going to have to find a way to govern. And I think that he is moderating some of his stances because he is recognizing that some of them may not actually be able to be implemented as easily as maybe candidate Trump thought.
Well, I don't think we should make any mistake. I think he will be a man of action, and he has to prioritize. You know, the slogan of his campaign was "Make America Great Again," and we're going to do that by focusing on terrorism, on jobs, on the border. As much as I and his other supporters would love to see Hillary Clinton being held accountable, locking Hillary up is not going to really go towards making America great again. So he's got to think about what he should spend his time doing. And right now that's focusing on the issues and stacking his cabinet.
Well, and it's also true that Americans want to see things get done.
That's right.
And under the present polarized atmosphere in Washington, there's not a whole lot getting done.
No, and we haven't seen any action really for years, which frankly I think is the main to current President Obama's, you know, overutilization of executive orders. So it'll be interesting to see now what happens, you know, come January 21st when we have a fully controlled Republican federal government, and how much action they actually do take, and how much then President Trump will utilize executive orders to do some of the things that he may want to do that maybe particularly members of the United States Senate might not share his views on.
But when this president comes into office, he's going to get leery looks from both sides of the aisle. I mean, there are a lot of Republicans who do not necessarily trust him just as much as Democrats.
Well, that might be a good thing. You know, Trump is going to be held accountable. This might be one of the most hated men in America. He's really loved by his supporters, but the media sure doesn't like him, and that could be a good thing because it will hold him accountable. He will deliver on a lot of his promises, I think, and again, this is all about action. The one thing I will say as a Trump supporter, I was a bit disappointed in his announcement about Hillary Clinton. If the DOJ thinks there's something to investigate there, they ought to be allowed to do that.
Well, and he can't do something unilaterally anyway. I mean, it's not really up to him. I mean, if the law enforcement officials ultimately do come to a conclusion, for example, with the Clinton Foundation, it's going to be incumbent upon them to take action. You know, but Donald Trump himself is not going to be the person that's going to have to drive that train. He's the president, not the attorney general.
Right. Yeah, I think this is all about narrative, about bringing the country together. But the reason a lot of his supporters are a little bit disappointed right now is because nobody should be above the law, including Hillary Clinton. Justice should be blind. Justice doesn't know your last name. It doesn't know if you ran for president. And I don't think he should have completely closed the door on the whole Hillary investigation.
But it is, I mean, the country sort of wants to be in the middle, somewhere between, you know, Democratic liberalism and Republican conservatism. The country kind of wants that middle road, doesn't it?
Sure. I mean, I think more than anything else, I think that the American people wanted constructive dialogue between Democrats and Republicans, between East Coast, West Coast, and the Midwest. You know, this is the time that we need to be able to come together because it's been so divisive over the last, year to 18 months through the 2016 presidential election. People want to see a government of action, and I think they want to have substantive policy discussions, not some kind of a witch hunt trial that might be going on, for example, through congressional hearings on Hillary Clinton.
Ohio went for Donald Trump.
Indeed, by 11 points.
All right, Capri Cafaro, Kristen Tate. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Get ready for crowded roads and airports because more people are traveling for this Thanksgiving than in the last decade. That's according to AAA, which predicts all Americans will travel 50 miles or more compared to last year. That's 1 million more people on the move. Catherine Herridge, live at Union Station in D.C. now. Catherine?
Well, John, for Amtrak, this is really like game day. This is the busiest weekend of the entire year, and the peak days are Tuesday, today, and Sunday, and they're expecting in excess of 750,000 passengers. Here at Union Station, there is a very highly visible security presence, and many of the passengers told us that this is simply not an issue.
I guess I'm kind of neutral to it. I guess in a way it makes you feel a little bit more safe.
I just messaged that to my parents. I was like, there's extra security today for some reason.
I just feel like it's been less of a target, so generally speaking, it seems safer.
If you're traveling this weekend, you should expect to see a lot of these K9 teams. Their specialty is explosive detection, and they're really good at clearing large groups of passengers quickly and efficiently. Earlier this week, an Amtrak spokesperson told reporters that their security posture is really unchanged over last year.
Amtrak police are increasing their presence along with local, state, and federal partners, as well as increasing canines throughout the stations and on railways along our right-of-way. That's typical for any holiday. We would always boost our efforts security-wise.
It's the same advice whether you're taking the trains or you're flying this holiday weekend. They really want you to pack conservatively and to leave a lot of extra time for the pickup as well as the drop-off, John.
And they have special crisis teams ready to go, huh, if they're needed?
Well, that's right. So there's a role here for Homeland Security as well as TSA. They have these special crisis response teams. They have a surge capability, and they're able to deal with terrorism as well as criminal activity.
We will have our Viper teams out, so those are our visible intermodal protection and response teams. These are the teams of TSA law enforcement agencies that work closely with local law enforcement. So you'll see more of that. They'll be running more of what they call the rail-safe operations, where there's a visible presence in stations and terminals.
As you travel through the stations this holiday weekend, if you pay close attention, you may see a scanner like what you're seeing here. It uses sound waves, and it's able to scan an entire crowd to pick up suspect devices. What we also were told by the Homeland Security Secretary recently is that the global threat picture remains high but essentially unchanged.
Our basic assessment of the global threat environment has not changed. We remain concerned about homegrown violent extremists who could strike the homeland with little or no notice.
If there's really a difference over last year, it's with this perimeter security. You can expect to see a lot more of it around these pickup and drop-off areas, largely because there were 2 successful terrorist attacks on airports overseas, and in those cases, the operatives used taxis to move their bombs to the target, John.
Catherine Herridge in Washington, thank you. Well, from trains to planes, millions of Americans expected to prepare for Thanksgiving. Take a live look at all the planes in the skies over the U.S. right now. AAA also gets into the plane predicting business, saying more than 3.5 million people will fly between today and Sunday. That's a little more than last year. The TSA is keeping an eye on security lines at big airports, and there are extra canine teams on hand as well. Jonathan Hunt, live at Los Angeles International Airport. How's everything moving there, Jonathan?
I have to say, John, that as of now, it's all moving pretty smoothly here at LAX. And as far as we hear, pretty much the same story across the country. The check-in lines at the terminals we've been here to at Los Angeles International are pretty much the same as you would expect on any given Wednesday. The same with the security lines. TSA seems to be processing people pretty quickly, so no major problems. Even though LAX is expected to be one of the 3 busiest airports in the country over this Thanksgiving holiday, along with Atlanta and Chicago. Over what officials refer to as the 11-day travel period, some 27 million Americans are expected to fly. 2.3 million, almost 1 in 10 of those, passing here through LAX. But so far, as I say, John, it is moving pretty well. John?
What about security? Is that an issue?
Well, security is always an issue at every airport right across this country. And obviously, security is stepped up to some extent on holidays like this one, which would prove to be attractive targets for any would-be terrorists. So there are extra TSA agents on duty, not just to keep those lines moving, but obviously to provide for everyone's safety. The LAX Police Department also tells us they are ready for anything. Listen here.
We're constantly checking intelligence sources. We have great relationships with our federal partners here. We're looking for threats. We're doing training virtually every week on whatever might be coming our way. So we're ready. We have great people here, and so people should be comforted by that.
And as you take a live look at Denver International Airport, it seems to tell the same story that we're seeing right across the country at airports everywhere, John, that those streamlined screening processes coupled with relatively calm weather everywhere mean there are no significant delays right now. Everybody seems to be having, for the moment, a happy Thanksgiving travel experience. John?
Well, let's hope that keeps up right through the weekend. Jonathan Hunt, thank you. Coming up, investigators have just given an update on that terrible bus crash in Tennessee that, as we learn, as the man behind the bus, driving the bus, I should say, has a troubled history behind the wheel before the crash that left 5 kids dead. A toxicology test found no trace of alcohol or drugs in the blood of the school bus driver after Monday's deadly wreck in Tennessee that killed at least 5 children. That, according to the Chattanooga police chief, who held a news conference earlier this hour. Investigators also say they are reviewing surveillance video from inside the school bus. Police arrested 24-year-old Jonathan Walker on charges of vehicular homicide and reckless driving. Police say 6 children are still in the hospital. Walker accused of speeding on a winding road before flipping the bus and slamming it into a tree. Not confirm reports claiming that Walker asked the children if they were ready to die before the crash. The chief says no witnesses have told investigators that. Joining us now, Fox News legal analyst Mercedes Colwin. We always want to know why, after something like this happens, if there were no traces of drugs or alcohol in the driver's system, why? Where do you go?
I mean, that's a great point. I mean, what do you do? That's the first thing you do. Is like, was he inebriated? Was he in an altered state? Something has to give, because this is such a catastrophic event. Then you move into, well, did he drive recklessly? And what you're left with is he drove over the speed limit. There was a 30-mile-per-hour speed limit in that particular area. It was a windy road. He probably took it too fast. Of course, the experts have to come in to start looking at the tire tracks, whether he actually slammed on the brakes. What did he do? You'll get the expert to come forward and say one way or the other whether he was speeding, at what level he was speeding at.
I was surprised to learn that investigators actually need a search warrant to get the camera footage from inside the bus and the black box, the data recorder that tells them exactly what the bus was doing. You need a search warrant for that?
Well, there's a presumption of innocence. I mean, all he's been arrested, he's charged with the crime, he hasn't been convicted of a crime. You need a search warrant to get some of the material, some of the evidence, and that's obviously critical evidence. It's going to show his behavior within the bus, and especially how if he was actually taunting these children, as he's accused of taunting them and saying, "Are you ready to die?" We'll hear that, especially from the recorder.
He only got his bus driver license back in April, and he had already had one accident where apparently he was taking a curve, maybe too high a rate of speed. He kind of crossed over the center line, an oncoming car clipped the side of the bus. So, or the bus clipped the side of the car, not sure which. Does that kind of record suggest that he's going to perhaps face, I mean, can it give him additional penalties for what happened in this particular case?
Great question. If he has some pre-existing act that can certainly show that he was going to do something similarly, there was some foreseeability about his conduct, sure, that may come in a civil proceeding, undoubtedly. If he had some sort of record of doing this in the past, and criminally, it'll have to be up to the judge. Criminally, they may decide that that's just too prejudicial. We're not going to let it go forward. And frankly, there really wasn't any, obviously not catastrophic like this. There were no tragedies, there was no injury. There were no sirens that went off in anyone's head that said this is going to lead to a much worse accident in the future. So probably not. It probably won't be able to come in, at least in the criminal.
Talking about civil cases, Durham School Services ran the bus line. It doesn't sound as though that's the school district.
Right.
But the district itself is probably on the hook as well here, potentially.
Undoubtedly. You will see so many civil suits. I mean, how tragic. You have 5 lives that were lost here, 5 little ones that were lost. Plus you have some additional 6 children that are in the hospital with varying degrees of injury. So in the final analysis, we're going to have at least 11 lawsuits.
5 children dead as of now. There could be others. 4 of them little girls. It is just an atrocious story. Mercedes Colwin.
Very tragic.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Well, more ahead from the Fox News deck on this Thanksgiving Eve. This year, instead of eating turkey, how about tater tots? Tater and tot would sure appreciate it. They are the lucky birds getting President Obama's final turkey pardons. Take you to the White House next.